It's been 100 days since Donald Trump re-entered the White House, and right alongside him has been something that I consider to be even scarier, which I will talk about why that is here in a bit. Christian nationalism. As I've challenged Christians, everyday Christians, to ask themselves before, I once again ask them, is this really about protecting religious freedom, or are we watching the first steps toward a full-blown Christian theocracy? And are you actually convinced that that is a good thing? Okay, because let's start with one of the first moves in Donald Trump's first 100 days. Donald Trump's first 100 days. February 6th, which was only 3 days before my birthday, Trump signed an executive order establishing the task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. It's headed by none other than Attorney General Pam Bondi, who recently held the first official meeting of this ridiculous task force just in the past week or so. And the task force was created to comb through federal agencies, looking for any policies and actions they can label as discriminatory against Christians. They have the power to recommend certain actions, the power to push for new legislation that would allegedly protect religious liberties. And this is very manipulative rhetoric, because if you're familiar with how authoritarian regimes work, this should ring some alarm bells. Okay, creating a government body to police bias, not just against any religious group, but against the dominant religious group in a country, is not only a classic authoritarian move, okay, it's downright ridiculous. It's absurd. Pretending the majority of a belief system in a country, pretending that that majority is under attack to justify giving it even more power. That's what we're seeing. That is how you fabricate a persecution narrative. Growing up in the evangelical Christian church, I was convinced that Christians were persecuted. And that is false. It is so false, but that's how far down the levels of feeling like Christians are persecuted goes. Some random ass white girl in Tulsa, Oklahoma thought that she was being persecuted, that she was being discriminated against because she was fighting the good fight for the Lord God Almighty. And making the privileged feel like victims is how you can then sell them the solution of authoritarian control. And that's why I think Christian nationalism is so dangerous. But let me be crystal fucking clear. You can't discriminate against a dominant demographic. And what do I mean by discriminate against a dominant demographic? I'm talking about a group of people who holds the majority of the country's power and material wealth. By and large, Christianity, as much as I wish it were otherwise, it is the dominant cultural ideology in this country for now. Christian megachurches, as I talk about, in this country have so much wealth and influence over their congregations, as again, we've talked about plenty of times on my channel. To suggest that they're being persecuted is laughable. They're not even being taxed. So the executive order on February 6th, it did end up, it filtered down into how federal agencies operate, and that's just the start. We have seen the Department of Veterans Affairs, for example. They sent out instructions telling employees to report any instance of perceived anti-Christian discrimination. And that could include things like denial of religious accommodations or retaliation. That's how it's framed. But what it really boils down to is calling out or tattletaling on people who are being bullies, who are being assholes, okay? And really, let's think about what this means for the coworkers. This means that anyone can now report a coworker for being insufficiently deferential to their religion, to the dominant religion in this country. And other departments got similar orders. And what's being built here, it's not about religious freedom. It's a culture of internal surveillance where suspicion and frustration are weaponized in the name of Christianity. It's giving 1984 by George Orwell. Okay. And meanwhile, inside the White House, Trump installed televangelist Paula White. You guys know I'm Paula White's #1 fan. okay, for the newly created faith office. That's what it's called. If you don't know Paula White, I've known Paula White for a long ass time. And let me just catch you up to speed if you didn't grow up worshiping the ground she walked on. She is a prosperity gospel preacher known for sermons that promise wealth and success if you just pray, and donate hard enough. And she's been called out by both secular and other Christian groups, okay, for promoting a theology that treats God like an ATM machine. Not even all the Christians like her. And now she's embedded in the federal government. That's why I say that Christian nationalism is not about faith, it's about power. Okay, the creation of the faith office led by someone like Paula White is a direct move to align government functions with a specific, hyper-commercialized, hyper-capitalized, authoritarian-friendly brand of Christianity. Not just any Christianity, authoritarian. And the particular flavor of it that benefits Trump politically. Okay, because prosperity gospel is the perfect religious match for a movement that equates wealth with virtue, power with blessing, and dissent with demonic attack, as I've talked about before, and what Christians truly believe to be a divine spiritual warfare in which they must act as righteous warriors. Trump has openly framed his political leadership as a righteous crusade against secular and progressive forces and the modern world and the liberal Hollywood elites. Like all of these things he's saying is speaking in religious terms about his enemies, describing them not as political opponents in a democratic, functional, progressive society, but as evil that must be purged. And anyone who grew up in the evangelical Christian church like I did can spot this rhetoric from a mile away. This isn't just a messaging, this is a messaging strategy, but beyond that, it's escalation. It's almost a mobilization of the church congregations in this country. Because that is what happens when you define your political struggle with a spiritual war. And now this preacher-style rhetoric is being pumped directly into American political culture from the highest office in the land. No big deal. And of course, I do always have to make the caveat and say not all Christians. Like, not everyone is cheering alongside the Christian nationalists. It's true that evangelical leaders widely and conservative Christians widely, especially those who see Trump as like a divinely appointed figure, they've largely embraced all of these initiatives. For them, the erosion of secular governance isn't a bad thing at all. They believe that religious dominance is necessary to save America from moral decay. I was taught this in high school. But critics do exist. And thankfully, they are many, if not just the actual majority of Christians. They see things very differently. There are organizations like Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Other organizations have warned that these moves privilege one religion over all the others, that they violate the First Amendment, and that they fundamentally, and this is key, undermine religious freedom itself. When the government picks a side in matters of faith, it stops being the natural protector of liberty. It stops being something we can rely on. It becomes an enforcer of a specific denomination of orthodoxy. And many Christians, even myself growing up, might think this will benefit them. But in time, they will see that it does not. In just 100 days, Trump's administration has made it unmistakably clear to myself and others who are watching and studying this that Christian nationalism isn't some fringe movement lurking in the shadows anymore. It is sitting in the Oval Office, it is signing executive orders, it is setting policy, and it is defining what it means to be a quote-unquote real American. If the separation of church and state collapses, religious minorities, secular citizens, and anyone outside the approved orthodoxy will be the first to feel the consequences, but it won't stop there. And this is what I am begging everyday Christians to see. When governments use religion as a political weapon, everyone loses. We have seen this time and time again. And the only question now is whether enough people will recognize the danger before it's too late. And the thing that we have to understand, the thing that history teaches us again and again, is that religion and authoritarianism have always gone hand in hand. And I'm not saying that religion, organized religion, has to lead to authoritarianism, though I'd love for anyone to point out a time in human history in which it didn't. What I am saying is that when authoritarian regimes rise, they instinctively recognize that religion is one of the most powerful tools available for controlling people, because faith by nature asks for trust. It asks for loyalty and obedience. And in the hands of more compassionate leaders on a smaller scale, yes, that trust can build communities. I see that. But as it grows in the hands of authoritarian rulers, it becomes a tool of empire. Okay? And that is what I want to point out to people. It is a tool of empire. Throughout history, we see the same pattern. Okay? Religious institutions, particularly monotheistic religious institutions, those are the ones that end up hand in hand with authoritarian regimes. Polytheistic religions aren't as often used in the same way. But for example, from the divine right of kings in medieval Europe to the pharaoh of Egypt, that was supposedly both divine and a state, power, to the state churches that enforce the apartheid in South Africa, okay, to the role of today's ultra-conservative Christianity in justifying segregation and Jim Crow laws in the United States, okay? Religion has been used again and again to give moral cover to deeply immoral political systems. That's why we talk about moral panic and saying, using rhetoric that should scare families into falling in line. Because when leaders can convince people to conform, when they can convince them that dissent is not just political rebellion, but moral rebellion, okay? They can crush the opposition. They can justify taking extreme action to crushing that opposition far more ruthlessly and with far less backlash. And that is why Christian nationalism is so dangerous. It's not just about personal faith. It's not about internal transformation. It's not about spiritual growth. It's about using a religious majority as a weapon to seize and maintain political power. As I always say, it's not about faith at all. It's about power. And as much as I do think that diehard Christian nationalists who openly call themselves that are in fact the minority of people who call themselves Christians, it's time to ask everyday Christians, are you sure this is what you want to be aligned with? And again, it's not that I think that Paula White being in the White House is inherently more violent and dangerous than disappearing grad students who wrote an op-ed critical of Israel. It's not that I think that the anti-Christian bias task force is somehow a worse kind of legislation or worse kind of executive order than the disappearing of people who are here legally in this country, and also those who might not have their correct documentation but are still human beings that deserve the dignity of due process in this country. Like, obviously there are so many worse things going on, but what I think Christian nationalism actually speaks to is the fact that the reason Trump is in the White House, the reason we are on day 100, okay, is because of the cultural ideology that allowed him to get there. Okay, he's not a fluke. He is the result. Donald Trump is the result of these internal beliefs, this cultural ideology that I am actually trying to get to the root of, that I am actually trying to fight. And that is what I think is the most dangerous thing about Christian nationalism.